This episode of Brains on Games is all about launching satellites in space. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and this is the 50th episode of Brains on Games. I can't even believe I've posted 50 videos so far. This episode, like I said earlier, is all about launching satellites into space. It's an award-winning game that was sent to me by the designers, a game called Orbital Velocity. Orbital Velocity is a game that works with 2 or 4 players. It can be played by kids aged 10 and up, and you can play a game in about half an hour. What is this game all about? Well, really, it's about the 50s space program. It's a game where you're launching these booster rockets in order to place satellites in orbit. How do you do that? Well, you've got cards. Each player starts with 5 cards with numbers on them. Those numbers will allow you to take this booster and move it around the board. You can see here on the board, you've got a picture of the Earth, and here are these different orbits you're going to be competing for. Only one player can place a satellite in each orbit, and the player who's placed the most satellites at the end of the game is going to be the winner. They have tried really hard to make this game scientifically accurate. So you've got actual orbit names here. You've got a rocket that is pretty good at big movements and maneuvers, but has a harder time with fine adjustments. This does take place in the 50s after all. And the way that they represent that is through the frequency of the cards in the deck. The large numbers occur in large quantities in this deck of cards. So there's 9 cards that have the number 9 on them. There's 8 with 8 and 7 with 7. The numbers 1, 2, and 3 only have 3 each. And then there's a minus card. There's a total of 6 minus cards in the deck, and that will allow your rocket to move in reverse so that you can slow things down. What you're trying to do, like I said, is move this rocket around the board. It is a push-pull game. Both players are moving the same booster, and then they're trying to launch the satellite of their color. You place a satellite holder on the space that you're aiming for. So your first orbit, low Earth orbit here, you have to get your booster rocket to number 39. If you overshoot it, you lose the rocket, and the player who caused that to happen also loses a card. You're just playing cards to move this thing around. So if I play a 6, he's going to go to 6. And then if the other player plays an 8, he's going to jump up to 14. You can see that there's some mental math, lots of addition. Multiplication does come in later on, but that's all under the hood. You're just playing cards and moving this thing around. Eventually, somebody probably is going to get this booster onto that number 39 space, and then they'll win the orbit. You take the holder, you put their satellite in that holder, and that goes on the low Earth orbit spot. In the second round, you're moving to middle Earth orbit. You put your satellite holder here to mark that as the target space. But now you're working with 2 rockets, and this does change things. You can move either one, although if there's a rocket that's still on the launch site, you do have to move that before you fiddle around with the other ones, and that prevents players from leaving one rocket on the start space and only working with the other one. If you play an 8, he's going to go to here. Now, if another player moves a booster onto the same space as a booster that's already there. So if you've got 2 on the same space, your movement is going to be doubled. It's boosted in this case. So now if I play a 6, this rocket is going to move 12 spaces. If I'm decelerating one of these rockets, I would play that minus symbol, like I said, and then maybe I'll play a number 2, and this is going to move back 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces instead of 2 spaces. Each time you play a card, you draw back up to your full hand size, whether it's the initial hand size of 5, or if you've overshot on a previous round, then your hand size is 1 smaller. You might be working with only 4 cards. You continue going around. Now, where the strategy comes in, and it does become more challenging, and for me more interesting as you go through each round. Each round you add another booster, and you're trying, really the strategy here is trying to make sure that you are not the player who puts the rocket in range of the target space on the board. Partly that's because there are so many of these large numbers here. If I need to get to 38 and I've got a booster on 29, there's 9 nines in the deck. The other player's likely to have something that's going to get it, if not right on the space, then really close. You might then be trying to decelerate and keep things out of the way. So at the beginning of the round, you're really trying hard not to be the one that puts the rocket in range. That is your strategy. You might throw away a card in order to prevent the other player from putting a rocket on the target space. For example, if things are doubled, here I'm at 26 and I play a 5, I'm going to move all the way ahead to 36. If I play a 6, that would get me right on the space that I want to. So I might try and overshoot that boosted rocket. I might lose a card, but the other player won't be able to put the rocket on the middle Earth orbit space. Now, if I have lost a card and I land a rocket here in that parking orbit, I get an extra card back. So you can replenish your hand, but this is a lot of risk management, really is what you're doing. You're moving these boosters around the board using addition, or if it's doubled or tripled, using multiplication. Really, yes, you're doing those math calculations. That isn't the point of the game, of course. Really, the point of the game is, because it's that push-pull, you're working on probability and risk management. You want to make sure that you don't give the other player a good chance to get that booster into range of that target space or on top of that target space. Let me tell you what happened when I played with my son. The board looked something like this. He had won 2 orbits. I had won 1. There was one that nobody won, and we were competing for L2. If he had won L2, of course, he's going to win the game because he'd have 3 satellites up there. But if I had won L2, we would be tied 2 satellites to 2. But because mine was in the higher orbit, I would be the winner of the game. Everything hinged on who won this space. And we had 5 rockets. So each move we were really thinking about trying to double things up to mess up the other player so they'd overshoot. He only had 4 cards in his hand by the time we got to this point. We came to a situation where I didn't have great cards. I was out of the deceleration cards. I had a few big numbers, and I could see my son's cards. He had 4 of these cards with white backs, only 1 that was black. Now, why does that matter? Why are the cards in the deck different colors? Well, the light colored cards are even numbers and the dark ones are odd. That gave me the clue that he had only 1 odd number in his hand. And remember, there are only 3 cards in the deck with the number 1. I had 1 of those cards and we had a great big pile still left. So here's my son with 1 odd number. There are 2 odd numbers. There are 2 odd. Well, the number 1 is always odd, but there are only 2 number 1s left in the deck, and he only had 1 black card. I decided to take a chance, and I moved the booster onto number 34. Now, what was that 1 odd card that he had? Out of all of this great big deck, of course, he had the number 1. So he did wind up winning the game, but I was thinking, what are the odds? What's the likelihood that out of all of this big stack of cards, he's got 1 of the 2 cards that would allow him to win the game if I put it on this space? Yes, you're doing the calculations, but you are thinking about probability, you're thinking about frequency of the cards in the deck, and you're thinking about risk management. Because the card backs are such an obvious signal about what cards you might have, younger kids do tend to focus on even versus odd. And of course, in that turn that I told you about, I was noticing that my son only had 1 odd card, but really what I was thinking about was that there were only 2 possible cards that would allow him to win if I put that rocket there. The math is really under the hood in Orbital Velocity. It's not a math game where you're purposely thinking about performing calculations or practicing your math. Really, it's encouraging players to think about probability, like I said. Yes, there's math, but really you're just doing the calculations for your movement, and you do a lot of those calculations. When you've got 4 or 5 rockets on the board, you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how am I going to make sure that there's not a rocket that's going to be in range of this number 35 or number 36 space. And that's Orbital Velocity in a nutshell. An award-winning game with lots of math under the hood that works hard to be scientifically accurate. You've got orbits that are named after real orbits around the Earth. You've got boosters that are not very good at fine adjustment of speed or direction. It was the 50s after all. And you've got a game that gets kids thinking about frequency and probability. As usual, if you have any questions or suggestions for me, you can find me at brian@brainsongames.ca. brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will be posted, and previous episodes are already up there now. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, and I've been posting unboxing pictures on the Instagram feed. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.